we have to kind of ask ourselves, like, to what extent am I obligated to, to follow my parents' wishes? How broad is the mitzvah of kibbud av v'eim? And he says only things that are directly connected to their welfare is something that you'd have to sort of engage in. Something that's not connected with their welfare, but it might indirectly upset them, is not something that you have to care about, right?
This is the Dilemmas on Screen, a Jewish perspective podcast, where we take ambiguous moral situations in fictional popular movies and TV shows and analyze them from a Torah lens. As a quick overview, in the Top Gun movie that came out in 2022, Maverick, who's played by Tom Cruise, is a top fighter pilot, and he is recruited to train junior pilots for a special mission. Rooster, who's one of the junior pilots, is the son of Maverick's deceased best friend, Goose. Now, Rooster resents Maverick for two reasons. The obvious reason is that Rooster blames Maverick for his father's death, even though it wasn't Maverick's fault. It even went so far as Maverick was cleared from blame by a military inquiry. It was just an accident. It was a freak accident. Goose died. It was tragic, but it ultimately was not Maverick's fault. There's a second reason, and we only find this out later, is that Maverick apparently also pulled Rooster's Naval Academy application papers. This set Rooster's career back by 4 years and didn't stop him from pursuing the career he wanted. We also later find out Maverick tells his former girlfriend, Penny, that he promised Rooster's dying mother that Rooster would not become a pilot like his father. And you can imagine the weight of such a request on Maverick. At the end of the day, the widow of your former partner is now asking you to stop her son from engaging in the same career that got his father killed. Now, Rooster is not aware of his mother's request, and Maverick decides to take the full blame from Rooster so that Rooster would not also blame his mother. With that, we have a few questions we'd like answered. First, and most importantly, does a parent have the right to interfere or request such interference in her son's career or her kid's career generally? Does it make a difference if the parent interferes directly as opposed to requesting a third party interfere? And if the parent does not have the right to interfere in a kid's career, what if the child's decision involves mortal risk? Does that change the calculus? At the end of the day, this is a very dangerous profession. You're literally going in as a fighter pilot on this super sophisticated aircraft with the possibility of dying, going to enemy territory. Does that change anything? And let's say the answer is no. It doesn't make a difference. It's a kid's decision. He can choose to do what he wants. Does it make a difference if that career that he's going into is the exact same one that got the child's father killed? So those are our first layer of questions. The second is, does a senior soldier or officer, are they allowed to intervene by pulling a junior soldier's papers, even though he presumably did not have the junior soldier under his command? Another question, does it make a difference if the parent or the third party suspects the child won't give up, and this will just cause the child to take a longer road? Finally, can the senior soldier or officer interfere and then keep the mother's request quiet to preserve the peace between her and her son? Is it morally praiseworthy for Maverick to take the blame so Rooster doesn't blame his mom? These are the questions that we want answered. Let's see what the Torah perspective is. I am excited to welcome Rabbi Yoni Sonnenblick to this episode to answer our questions. Yoni Sonnenblick is a rabbi and therapist who focuses on the intersection between Torah and psychology. He lives in Baltimore with his wife and kids. Hi, Rabbi Yoni. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's great to see you again. All right, so let's launch right into it. Does a parent or a mother, don't know if it would change anything, but does a parent have the right to interfere in her kid's career or like kind of mandate what career choice he can make? So we'll start with that.
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a really interesting response from somebody named the Maverick. And the Maverick is taking up an argument with the Rush, Rabbi Yoni Usher, also a very early commentator.
You did placing them like who's the Maverick? Like when did he live? Or just like a brief blurb.
The Maverick I think is around the 1600s or so. I may be wrong about that. The Rush is an early commentator, is the 1300s. So he's what we call a Rishon. And so the Rush had said as follows. He's talking about the following scenario. Somebody came to their son and they said, look, I got into a fight with this guy and I don't want you to speak to him. I don't want you to have anything to do with him. If he comes to talk to you, I'm asking that you ignore him. Okay. And so the question was, does the son listen to his father? There's a mitzvah of kibbud av v'eim, to respect your father's wishes. your father said, I don't want you anywhere near this guy. Do you listen? Do you not listen? Fascinating kind of question, which is, probably quite common. So,
Right.
so this is what he's discussing. And the Rush says that if your father doesn't want you to speak to him, then don't speak to him. But the Maverick actually argues. And the Maverick says, first of all, let me just kind of introduce another idea. Here's something the Talmud talks about. How far do we take this mitzvah of respecting your parents' wishes? Let's say your parent tells you, you know what? This week, I'd like you to not keep Shabbat. This week, I'd rather you kind of go with me to the stadium. So do you say, all right, it's my parents' wishes, right? Maybe you could instruct your parent, hey, I really want to go to the stadium. Maybe you could kind of command me to do that, and then I'll end up doing that. I mean, how far are we going to take this?
You could say, it's the 10 Commandments. Honor your parents. Just trying to do what the Torah says.
It's one of the top 10, right? What's actually going to beat that out? So the Talmud actually, I won't go into all the technical details, but the Talmud actually says, based on the verse, based on the pasuk that introduces the mitzvah of kibbud avim, it actually ends by saying, Ani Hashem, I am Hashem. And the Talmud's way of reading that is that although you really have to honor your parents, it's so important, that's only true until it gets into the honor of God. And so if it's getting in the way of a mitzvah, it's to ask you to perform a sin, that's where we say the parent no longer has any, respect from that child, and you have to listen to what God says. And so you don't drive to the stadium and you don't eat non-kosher or whatever it is that your parent is instructing you. So the Maverick says two things. Number one, he says, well, your parent seemingly is asking you to transgress a sin. Why? Because there's a mitzvah in the Torah, v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Specifically, especially if it's a Jew who's involved, v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, you should love your friend like yourself. So if it's somebody else who's a member of the tribe, so we'd say he's basically asking you to hate somebody or to not interact with somebody. That person's not going to feel your love, right? If you kind of give him, the cold shoulder, that is not a fulfillment of v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha.
So actually, that's kind of funny because I remember, I grew up hearing that a lot, like that verse. But speaking of the Ani Hashem, that's actually how v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha ends. Whatever, there's a beginning to that verse and it says, etc. And then v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, Ani Hashem. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am God. And if I remember correctly, I think Rashi there said, maybe, I can't remember if it was Rashi, but someone there says because it's not you shall love your neighbor as yourself if you feel like it. It's you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am God who tells you to do that, whether you like it or not.
Right, exactly, right.
So this isn't like a mitzvah of convenience when you're like, hey, I really like this guy, or he did something good for me, or
yes, absolutely. Sometimes we think that the only person is kind of the person we choose. So that person I'll love, but that person is not part of that mitzvah. And like you're saying, of course, it's through and through. So you're really supposed to love somebody unless they really give you a reason not to. Again, sometimes maybe the father informs you this person's really a bad person. Okay, right? But if it's just, hey, I have a little issue with him, we don't get along, that really shouldn't trickle down into you. So that's the first thing the Maverick says. Okay. And that would be specifically because he's telling you to transgress a mitzvah. But then he says something that I think applies a lot more broadly. He ends up saying further that he says, in general, we have to kind of ask ourselves, to what extent am I obligated to follow my parents' wishes? How broad is the mitzvah of kibbud avim? And he says, you know what? I don't think your parent telling you who to talk to is even a fulfillment of your requirement of respecting your parents. He says only things that are directly connected to their welfare is something that you'd have to sort of engage in. Something that's not connected with their welfare, but it might indirectly upset them, is not something that you have to care about, right? So, for example, I'll just take this further for a second. I'm just thinking about the Jewish guilt that, moms and dads put on their children. So if your mom says, hey, looks like you've gained a few pounds, I want you to start eating a little healthier. So I think, the Maverick would say, like, in the nicest way, you don't have to tell your mother, right? We could talk about how you would share that with her or him, right? But, in the nicest way, well, that's not really included. It's like things that are direct. Now, your mom or dad might say, well, I'm a wreck. I'm so nervous and it really bothers me. That's, I feel for you, but I'm just telling you, like, that is not included in direct, welfare, right? If the parent says, help me get to the doctor, that's direct welfare. That's really direct. Can you do something for me? Can you change the way you live so that I am happier? That is not really included. It's too indirect. And so he sort of says, even if it's not an avera involved, a sin, you do have the right to sort of politely and respectfully decline.
Wow. That actually, that sounds directly on the money. So I guess that's a good example. So you're saying if a parent asks you to take you to the doctor, I'm assuming like to make them food. Is there anything like, I guess let's define like what is, I guess actually, let's take a step back. What is the mitzvah of, like, first, what's the source of honoring your parents? And again, let's just speak just generally what the general parameters are, because that is, and it sounds like there's room to argue here, and people do, but just so we get a sense of like, what does no one argue about, and then when do we start getting into shakier territory?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So, one of the 10 commandments, kabed es avicha v'esimecha, right, is to honor your parents. Now, I'll just kind of jump into one of the really interesting Talmudic arguments. Is the Talmud discussed the following case? Well, I need to honor my parents, but do I need to spend my money or their money? Right? So if a parent says, hey, I'd like to come visit you. So I have to spend time, and it's too indirect also to say, well, time is money. That's too far off, right? But I would have to spend time getting the room ready and getting food and, taking care of them, right? But who pays for that ticket?
I'm assuming like if they fly in it, like they have to fly in if they're from a different city.
If they're flying in, who has to pay for that ticket? They say, well, don't you want to honor your parent? You should pay for the ticket. Or do you have the right to say, listen, when you come, I would love to see you and I will treat you like a king and a queen that you are. But I don't have to go broke for you, right? And so it's a really interesting conclusion. It's very clear in the halacha that it's Mishel Av, that the parent has to spend their money. We could take this a little bit further, something that is more of a recent question. Sometimes people are estranged from their parents or they have...
And so just to quickly interrupt, when you said, I'm assuming that was just exaggeration. Like, you don't mean you don't have to go broke, but if it's just, you don't have to spend your own money, even if you have the money, right?
Even if you have the money, you don't necessarily have to spend your money. Now, again, I'm not discouraging you from spending your money. If you have that money and you feel like your parent will appreciate it and you like your parent appreciate it and you have hakara tatov, you have such appreciation for everything they've done. Of course, by all means, it's wonderful. It's beautiful. We can never repay our parents, just to be clear, right? But in terms of if you want to follow the strict letter of the law, right, you are not obligated to take out your credit card or checkbook every time, they want something. So that's just sort of a kind of introduction. Oh, what I was saying is that a more recent question that has come up, which is really sort of a testament to the times, is that what if it won't cost you financial loss to reach out to your parent? What if it'll cause emotional pain? Unfortunately, sometimes people have had, a bad childhood, or they have a very rocky relationship with a parent, and they're wondering, okay, but I have a mitzvah. Do I have to, just engage because there's a mitzvah called kibbut ve'em. And so, the answer that I think some modern day rabbis point out is just like finances, you don't have to spend your own money. So too, if you're truly traumatized, I'm not talking about somebody who's a little bit upset. Everybody, gets into fights here and there. Everybody has an issue here and there. I'm talking about if somebody is truly traumatized and it's going to cause them, serious emotional damage to stay in touch with that parent. Well, that's something where maybe we say, I don't have to spend my emotional finances.
Does that lead into, I think you said the Maharik, who says this is like that principle in terms of, does it directly affect the parents or not? Because that'll lead to the career.
It's a good question. He does say it when it comes to marriage, and he doesn't seem to say because of this really interesting reason of the Rashba. It sounds like he's just sort of putting out there that a child has sort of some of their own autonomy. I'll just share one other thing is that, just something that has to be pointed out is that, of course, in Jewish law, it's a really interesting blessing that we say when a child, a bar mitzvah boy, becomes bar mitzvah when he turns 13. So when a child is generally standing up in front of the Torah, doing their bar mitzvah laning, their reading of the Torah, they say something, Baruch shepatrani me'on shel, which means, blessed are you, God, who exempts me from this child's punishments, which basically means until now, I have been fully responsible for this child. And if this child is not developing in the right way, it's on me. It's my issue. And now, here on in, this is a man. He's 13, right? And I'm sort of thankful that I could kind of move on. Okay.
Okay.
So, and I'll add another interesting halacha. The law is that obviously an 8-day-old baby can't be responsible for their own circumcision, for their own milah. So who has that obligation? Of course, it's the parent. But if for whatever reason there was a child who was never circumcised, once that child turns 13, now it becomes the child's responsibility, now that he is old enough to take care of it on his own. And so what I'm pointing out is that there's a development where, of course, we as Jewish parents are very much responsible for our children, and we never shirk that responsibility. But there is supposed to be a progression where, as the child gets older and older, and this is reflected in halacha, I'm trying to have this child be able to sort of fly on their own and sort of do things on their own. My own kid has kids at different times. They asked me, could I, when they're young, could I cross the street by myself? And I can't tell you I always do this, but when I remember, I would say, not yet, right? Meaning, I think this really helps frame parenting in general. I know that's not our conversation, but it really helps frame parenting when you think that all of the no's that you're telling your child, they're not really no, because your child is going to be their own independent person at some point. And so the answer is not yet. I'm not yet ready for you to have a phone. I'm not yet ready for you to talk to the opposite gender. I'm not yet ready for you to cross the street or shoot fireworks. But you know what? The answer is not no. I can't really say no forever. It's not yet. And at some point, you're going to do that. And right now, while I have you still, and I may have your ear even just a little bit, I don't fool myself into thinking I have your ear entirely. But I'd say while I still have your ear to some extent, I'm going to try and share with you my values. But ultimately, it's going to be on you to make those final decisions. And so it's not yet. And so I turn back to this and say, using this Maverick, who says that the parent does not have the right to dictate that, I would say that, if Rooster was aware that his mom was really against this, this is his either it's his hobby or even more, it's his profession. And he doesn't really, through the letter of the law, he would not have to honor her wishes.
Wow.
He would be able to kind of do what he wants. And that's what I would think.
That was very well fleshed out. And it's a really interesting example of like the evolution of parenting effectively is when they're younger, you do have a more direct say. That's just, I don't think I'd ever thought of it in that fashion, but that does make a lot of sense. I think I'm going to go to like kind of a next question in terms of, does it change anything if there's like mortal risk? I mean, he is going to be a fighter pilot. He's going to be exposing himself to like fairly extreme danger. I mean, presumably the United States Air Force or whatever, I guess like the Naval Academy, right? The Navy would have their pilots' best interest in mind and will obviously go to great lengths to protect them.
Yeah. I guess I would just say one thing as we move into like, is it even appropriate for the mom to have this issue, which is kind of, because there's this danger. One thing I would sort of want to just talk about for a second is to me, it's almost like a shame that it goes down like this, where it has to be through back channels, where it has to be, without being able to talk directly to her son. And this sort of brings up for me the story of Joseph and his brothers and who couldn't get along and end up getting into such a fight that they sell him, and we know the story. And there's a language used over there that they couldn't get along, v'lo yachlu dabru l'shalom, that they couldn't speak words of peace. And again, on one level, it means they just didn't like each other. But some of the commentators point out that there's a language of speaking, v'lo yachlu dabru l'shalom. They couldn't speak, and they say, if each of them would have just sort of aired out their issues and spoken it out, it's almost a guarantee that the story of Joseph and his brothers would not have gone down in that way. And so, there's a place to sort of point out that this is almost tragic that, that the mom has to go through these back channels to ask somebody to pull Rooster's papers. That's something that is tragic in terms of, in terms of this question.
Yeah. Sorry, so I actually have two thoughts. So I'm not sure if the movie makes clear, like this is an assumption because I do not think that the movie makes this clear at all, but I would assume that the mother probably did. I'm sure there were fights. Yeah, I suspect they probably had a lot of conversations about it, but I have no idea. That is interesting. What you reminded me of, though,
this might have been like her last ditch effort, and she tried.
Right, especially since it was her dying wish, which again we'll get to that in just a minute.
Sure, sure.
But what you also reminded me of was, I remember hearing that, just because it's directly on point, was there's a verse in the Torah that says, "Lo tisna et achicha bilvavecha," you shall not hate your brother in your heart, which is very interesting because don't hate your brother in your heart. As long as you air it out, then good to go, right? Just don't keep it secret. But I heard someone once explain no, that's the whole point in terms of, sometimes someone will do something to us, like they'll, cut us off, the grocery line. Let's say it's a friend of ours, they treated us rudely, they did something to upset us, and we're really harboring resentment against them. How could they do such a thing? And then if you just hold on to that, the Torah is don't do that. Speak it, go tell them you're upset. And then often what happens is when you're hey, I'm really upset at you for doing that, what often will happen, not always, but often will be oh my gosh, I didn't realize that I had done that. I'm so sorry. I never intended. Or you find out I'm so sorry, my wife is in labor or something like that. And then suddenly you're oh my gosh, yeah, okay, you hug it out. It's no issue.
I also think that in general, when you admit that somebody hurt you, there's a certain vulnerability that you're sharing by sort of allowing somebody to know, by the way, you have the ability to hurt me. And that itself feels like you're showing a weakness, which is something that if we are a little bit broken or a little bit, we've been hurt in the past, it's very common to just close that up and just say, I don't want anybody to even know that, that I could be hurt. So, wow. I'm a therapist, so that comes up.
You're getting ego involved effectively. I would air it out, but by airing it out, I'm showing that, like you said,
well, you're admitting that you could be hurt. The word vulnerable is a Latin word. It means woundable. So if you could share something that is, that has, the capacity to make you wounded. So then maybe the person will say, well, let me fix you up. I feel so bad, but maybe they'll say, oh, I know where I could hit you again.
I wish, yikes, but yeah.
Yeah.
Let's
So
hope that most
that's
people
a
are
whole
not like
conversation. That's
Yeah.
I just want to return to to this other point that you're making. It is this is a dangerous situation, and again, not a rabbit hole we're going to jump down right now, but there are discussions in in Jewish law about what level of danger you're allowed to put yourself in, and actually those standards change whether or not they're for a hobby or for your profession. So that's actually really interesting. Is that there might be one standard of of playing. There are rabbis out there today who say that it is really it is prohibited to play tackle football. There are totally rabbis who say that would be really problematic because of the the prevalence of really serious injury that we're only learning about more and more today. But when it comes to your profession, so again, maybe if you'd be a professional football player, so then that might be a little bit different because there's a higher standard. You're allowed to take certain risks that you wouldn't otherwise take because it's for your profession. The Noda Yehuda lived in the 1600s, I believe, thereabouts, in Prague, and he discusses a case of somebody who is a hunter, and he basically says that to hunt for fun, he says, is really not a nice thing to do, and he says that's sort of what Esau, Jacob's brother Esau, that's what he did, and to kill an animal just for sport, he's not a big fan of that. But he says if you're hunting for your profession, even though there is certain danger involved in, I don't know, walking into the forest with a crossbow or whatever you have, it could be a dangerous situation. But he says for your profession, it'll be okay. And so, would he be allowed to do this if this was something that was like, I don't know. I saw recently that people on TikTok are they're going on the top of moving trains and they're jumping from part to part, and maybe they get more views. And that to me sounds like something that would be absolutely prohibited, not allowed. That's crazy, right? Being a fighter pilot, it doesn't have a high percentage of deaths. It has a high percentage of deaths compared to accountants, compared to paper cuts, stuff like that. So comparatively, there's, it's dangerous, but in terms of, numbers of fighter pilots, it's not a high percentage. And so I don't think that would be something that would be, that would be prohibited.
Okay. And then I guess kind of like following, and that makes sense. I guess just to kind of clear the air, if there was like a super high, like, is there some kind of threshold at which, like, if it's super dangerous, like it's, I don't want to give any numbers, but if it becomes like almost outrageously dangerous.
I'm not sure exactly. I could tell you that there's a interesting parallel discussion when it comes to Hilchot Shabbat, the laws of Shabbat. So there's certain things you can't do on Shabbat. And the question is, you're allowed to do almost anything to save a life. So the question is, well, I keep Shabbat, but also I want to save my life. At what point do I break Shabbat to save my life? Right? So let's say I think I might have an infection. Well, could an infection kill you? Could strep kill you? Should I drive to the pharmacy? Could strep kill you? Could it wait till tomorrow? Right? So these are conversations that happen. There is an interesting thing. Rabbi Akiva Eger lives in the first half of the 1800s. He's one of the greatest Talmudists of his time. And he says, if something is a 1 in 1,000 chance that it could really lead to something really dangerous, 1 in 1,000, then you could break Shabbat. And so people often use that threshold. I can't tell you if that would apply necessarily paralleled back to somebody's profession, but that's just an interesting source.
Okay, yeah, that is interesting. Okay, I guess, like, moving on to the next part. So I guess now focusing on Maverick. So he was like, I don't know if he was his commanding officer, but he clearly had the authority. Presumably, no one contests Maverick's ability to apparently have pulled Rooster's papers.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like, assuming that was done legally and he was permitted to do that, what does Judaism have to say about that in terms of was it permitted for Maverick? Like, how would Jewish law approach that? Could Maverick, like a senior pilot, pull a junior pilot's papers? Right. I guess from two perspectives: either A, because of the wish of the parent, or two, because he didn't think he was ready. And those are the two reasons he gave for doing it. It sounds like it was really mostly because of the death wishes of the parent, but apparently he didn't think Rooster was ready. So, kind of, how would we see that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I want to discuss it in two different points. I think they relate back to what you're asking. Let's start with the first. There is a concept in Jewish law and in secular law as well, of course, of taking a bribe. You're not allowed to take a bribe. And the Talmud in Sanhedrin gives lots of examples of somebody who was a judge. And the litigant, he found out he had some small connection. He said one of the litigants was usually brings him his food, delivers his food on Thursday, and today he brought it on Tuesday, 2 days early. And he says, okay, I can no longer be the judge on this matter. And so, this concept of when a person has to have the sort of self-awareness to check in with themselves and see, am I capable of making such a decision? Let me flesh this out a tiny bit more. There's a concept in psychology and therapy. And the concept is, there's a concept of transference. Transference is sort of what the client or the patient is bringing in. And then there's the concept of countertransference, which is, the therapist who's trying to be so helpful, right? What is this reminding him or her of? And there's a major focus on trying to be really aware of like, hey, do I have any experiences with this before? I was once in line for jury selection, and they ask this when they're picking a jury. It was a car accident, and they started asking each person, hey, were you ever in a car accident? Yeah, one time I got hit, so I'm afraid I'm going to go for the for the victim. Another person says, one time I hit somebody and they made such a federal case out of it, and I'm afraid I'm going to go for the other side. In the Hebrew word we would call is negiot, is it touches you. Something that touches you is something that could really cloud judgment. And so, one thing I wanted to bring up is that Maverick, he's a close friend of Goose, the father of Rooster. He ultimately has been cleared. It wasn't his fault. But we know people have all sorts of guilt that they harbor, even when it's pretty clear something's not their fault. Okay. The essence of neuroticism is the extreme of that, where you blame yourself for everything. But there are things like survivor's guilt, people who, somebody else doesn't come back from the war. Somebody doesn't come back as a hostage. The people who do come back, they sometimes are weighed down with such guilt. Why did I survive and someone else didn't? And so, what I'd like to explore is that, whether or not Maverick had the right to do this, I want to almost leave to the side for a second. What I think is a very powerful question to me is, should Maverick be making such a decision on his own? I don't know if we find anywhere where he is reaching out to his own mentor, making sure that he's really thinking this through clearly. And perhaps there's an aspect of, I just feel so guilty. I got to listen to, what the mom wanted, at the expense of Rooster and his career and his profession. And so, the first thing I want to point out is just that, I find it somewhat inappropriate and not self-aware to make that decision on his own.
That is really like an excellent point. That I was not anticipating going there, but that's, you're approached. by the widow of the person who you were kind of responsible. And again, he was cleared of guilt. It was not his fault. It was an accident, and Goose died. Now you're approached by the wish of this dying widow. He's clearly personally invested. Like,
clouded.
yeah, clouded. Your judgment is clouded. It's like, oh, I didn't think he was ready. That's a very convenient conclusion to reach, isn't it, Maverick?
Yeah, I think the whole sort of study of Musar, of character refinement, that is like a hallmark of Jewish study, is like a huge percentage of that is recognizing, there are full books written about this, through Torah sources, of sort of recognizing what is it that's actually going on deep down. I'll give you one example, just something that I remember reading. There's a Musar work, a character refinement work. It's called Divrei Yoshua, written by someone in the 1800s, a student of Rabbi Israel Salanter, who was one of the kind of, I'd say, I don't know if you want to call it founders, but really talks a lot about the subconscious and trying to get in touch with it. And this rabbi says, when you are trying to fix a character trait, you got to figure out where is it coming from before you try to fix it. Otherwise, you might be led down the wrong path. And he gives the following example. He says, let's say somebody comes home, a traditional family, the man has been out working and the wife is home and she cooks him a meal, and he comes home at 6:00, and he comes home every day at 6:00, and the food's not ready. And, it's not ready till 6:30, and he waits, and then he just explodes. Right. And I ask, what do I ask for? What do I want? And, he makes a whole big deal out of it. And okay, this is a problem. You got some anger management problems. We gotta work on this, right? Yeah, sure. But what do we have to work on? Maybe this person has just an anger issue. So you'd have to work on anger. Maybe he doesn't have an anger issue. Maybe he doesn't get angry at other people too often. He's not a road rage kind of person. He's not like that at all. Maybe he has an issue with respect for his wife. He doesn't, maybe he has an issue with hakarat hatov, recognizing all the good that somebody did, and he's just sort of falls short in that regard, and he needs to work on that. He doesn't work on his anger. Maybe he gets hangry. You know what hangry is? When you're hungry and you get angry, right? Maybe what we might call that he has an issue with his appetite for desire. Maybe he has a desire issue, and he just gets all worked up only then. He doesn't have an anger issue. And so the point is, let's look into the depth of what is the root of this issue, and let's become self-aware. And then we could say, here's what I need to work on, because I know getting angry at my wife for being a half hour late when she's busy with 1,000 other things, that's not appropriate at all. And so, there are entire works that talk about just, self-awareness. And, to me, Rooster, Maverick, right? He did not attend his yeshiva Musar Seder. He was getting a coffee, when they were studying Musar, right? Because you have to be aware that that's an issue. And so, right. so that's one piece, that I would have liked him to ask somebody else.
I do want to discuss, we can speak about this briefly, but was it, because I think we're sympathetic to the fact that Maverick didn't want to tell Rooster that this was Rooster's mom's wish, right? Maverick says, because Rooster's going to be mad. I'd rather him be mad at me than be mad at his mom. That makes total sense. But in terms of, is such a thing permitted? Like, you're kind of lying or withholding the truth. Is that a Jewish value?
Yeah. So that's a great question. And there are many sources. And I think someone has to be careful about this, because how far do you take it? Right. But there are many sources. The most famous one is a song that we sing, Kala Nova Chasudav, right? Is that there's a famous debate between Beis Shammai and Beit Hillel about, if the groom sees, he's there with his new wife, his bride, and, he turns to someone and says, what do you think of her? Right? So one of the rabbis says, well, you got to be honest. You got to say, if you think she's pretty, then say she's pretty. If you don't think so, then say not,
Does it say she's not pretty, or just don't say anything at all?
Or don't say anything, right? Okay. But you can't lie. Basically, you can't lie. And that's a very rigid interpretation of lying, obviously. But the way we rule is like Beit Hillel, who says, Kala Noava Chasudav, which means she is so beautiful. She looks amazing. She's incredible, right? Never mind that you can't look at her, right? But she looks incredible. And so, there are many sources like this that for the sake of peace, there's definitely a place, to allow for bending the truth. And again, I go to my previous point that as you bend the truth, you should not feel, oh, this is so much fun. I get to bend the truth.
That's I like that. Rabbi Sonnenblick, this was great. Thank you so much for
this is great for me. Us. Thank you, Ophir. You're doing great stuff. Great to see you. Keep up the great work, and thank you so much.
Thank you for tuning in to the Dilemmas on Screen, a Jewish Perspective podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe. If you have any suggestions for a moral dilemma you'd like analyzed, feel free to send it over. Thanks again, and see you next time.